All right, mic check. 1, 2, 3. Testing. 1, 2, 3. Hail, fellow travelers. Tim from Secret Fire Books here with Robert E. Howard's Almuric and Three-Bladed Doom. Testing. 1, 2, 3. Check. 1, 2. Yeah! How you do it? Hail, fellow travelers. Tim from Secret Fire Books here. It is a beautiful day in my neck of the woods. It is the middle of September, which means it is time for Cimmerian September, that wonderful, savage reading event created by Michael K. Vaughan purely to promote the works of Robert E. Howard, one of Michael's favorite writers and one of my favorite writers as well. If you don't know, the rules for Cimmerian September have always been fairly straightforward. If you've never read any of Howard's work before, read the original Conan the Cimmerian stories. And if you have read those Conan stories before, read anything else that's Robert E. Howard related. So that's what I've done this month. I have read 2 Robert E. Howard books so far this September. I've read Almuric and Three-Bladed Doom, and I'm going to be reviewing both of these back to back in this video in a sort of Cimmerian September double feature. So first, let's talk about Almuric. This book was originally published in 1939, 3 years after Robert E. Howard's tragic suicide, making it one of his many, many posthumous releases. The weird thing about this novel is that, according to all accounts, Robert E. Howard never actually finished writing it. So clearly, someone stepped in for him and picked up the slack between the years of his death and his publication. And I'll talk about that briefly in a few minutes. But first, let's get into the actual story. So we are thrown into the action pretty quickly in this story. Our main character is a guy named Esau Cairn. He is this sort of down on his luck, disgruntled blue-collar worker from 1930s America. And at the beginning of the story, he has recently murdered his own boss. We're not given too many details. It's heavily implied that Esau Cairn's employer was not a good guy. He might have had some shady business practices. He might have had some criminal affiliations. But regardless, Esau Cairn has just murdered him, and he is now on the run from the law. Thankfully, he has an acquaintance of his who is a scientist who possesses a matter transporter device. And we're never really given any more details than that. There are clearly aspects about this story that Robert E. Howard wanted to emphasize and other aspects that he didn't really care about. Or at the very least, those are the aspects that he never got around to before he passed away. So basically, this is a sword and planet story, or a planetary romance, if you will. This is Robert E. Howard's take on the sort of genre and tropes popularized by Edgar Rice Burroughs in his Barsoom series, featuring the character John Carter. And so in a similar way to John Carter, except through this matter transporter, Esau Cairn is sent to the distant planet dubbed Almuric. And because the transporter can't transport anything non-organic, he arrives on Almuric completely naked with no food or water or weapons or anything to help him survive on this alien planet. But thankfully, unlike Barsoom from Edgar Rice Burroughs' novels, Almuric isn't too different from Earth. The atmosphere is the same. The gravity is the same. He doesn't really have to adapt that much. He shows up in the middle of the wilderness, and the first living thing he encounters is another human. There are humans on Almuric, though they are this very primitive, kind of savage race of people. And the first person he bumps into is this hunter. He speaks perfect English. Again, don't question it. It's just one of those things that Robert E. Howard was not too focused on fleshing out in this story. But he bumps into this hunter who's ranging the wilderness. And at this point, there was no doubt in my mind, regardless of how much some other writer was involved in the writing of this book, this is clearly a Robert E. Howard story, because Esau Cairn immediately gets into a fist fight with this hunter. He punches his lights out, steals his knife, and then runs off into the wilderness. And so for the next several months, Esau Cairn just kind of survives as this wild, almost feral man living off the fat of the land and hunting the animals in the wilderness of Almuric. And it's also at this point on page 28 of this book that we get quite possibly the most Robert E. Howard paragraph I've ever read. And I'll read it verbatim for you. It says, this is from Esau Cairn's point of view, "I was living the life of the most primitive savage. I had neither companionship, books, clothing, nor any of the things which go to make up civilization. According to the cultured viewpoint, I should have been most miserable. I was not. I reveled in my existence. My being grew and expanded. I tell you, the natural life of mankind is a grim battle for existence against the forces of nature, and any other form of life is artificial without realistic meaning." So yeah, if you couldn't tell, this is definitely a Robert E. Howard novel. There's no doubt about that. Of course, Esau realizes that he will at some point have to have some kind of human companionship, and so he sets off in search of other people on this planet. And this search eventually leads him to this massive fortified city on top of a plateau. And as he's trying to enter the city, he is unceremoniously shot and then captured by the city's inhabitants, this tribe of very savage, warlike people. And I should mention at this point that there is no advanced technology on this planet. Unlike the Barsoom novels by Edgar Rice Burroughs, Almuric does not have any flying ships or laser weapons or sophisticated alien tech or anything like that. This is, for all intents and purposes, a sword and sorcery novel that just so happens to take place on a distant alien planet. Now, the highest form of technology that we see in this story is this very primitive, rudimentary kind of firearm, this sort of muzzle-loading, single-shot rifle. That's about as high-tech as it gets on Almuric. But in any case, Esau is captured by these savages, and he's held in their dungeon for a while. And then, through literal trial by combat, he is able to prove himself worthy. He proves himself worthy of their respect, and at that point, they welcome him into the tribe with open arms and dub him Esau the Iron Hand. And so at this point, Esau has firmly established himself as not just a man, but a warrior of Almuric, and he has decided to make this new planet his home. Now, of course, that can't be the end to this story. There needs to be at least one more threat for this narrative, and that comes in the form of the Yagas. Now, the Yagas are this other race of people that live on Almuric. They are these very demonic-looking, winged humanoids who have a lot of mystery and skepticism surrounding them. There are all these gruesome legends about them. They're said to be cannibals. They spirit people away in the night. They turn them into slaves at their castles in the distant mountains. And they're said to torture their slaves in horrible, gruesome ways. So it's their interactions, the Yaga's interactions with Esau Ironhand and his new friends, that make for the primary conflict of this novel. Interestingly enough, it's also in the third act of this novel where we clearly see Robert E. Howard's writing end and someone else's writing begin. As I mentioned earlier in the video, Robert E. Howard never finished the original manuscript for this book. Someone else finished it for him after his death. And we don't know who that is. There are a lot of rumors. The one that seems to hold the most weight points to Otis Edelbert Klein finishing the book for him. Klein was one of Howard's editors, and he was well known for writing his own Sword and Planet, planetary romance stories. So it very well could have been him. But again, it's just another rumor. We don't know for sure. In fact, we might never know the truth of who finished Almuric for Robert E. Howard. All I know is it definitely wasn't Howard himself, because at the point in the story where Esau Ironhand and his companions come into conflict with the Yagas, the writing just becomes really clunky and amateurish. The prose becomes really sloppy. The dialogue becomes really wooden. And everything takes off at a much faster pace. Robert E. Howard's writing already has a brisk pace to it, but the pace for the last act of this novel is way too quick, and everything ties itself up way too neatly. And without giving away too much about the ending, it also ends in a very uplifting, positive, almost saccharine kind of way. And that definitely was not Robert E. Howard's style. Not to say that he couldn't write optimistic elements to his stories, but usually when his stories had happy endings, they were bittersweet or ended on some kind of note of grim humor if they weren't outright tragedies. So yeah, he definitely did not write the ending to this novel. If I were asked as to how I think Howard would have finished this story, I would say that he probably would have finished it in a similar way to how he finished the Conan story, The Queen of the Black Coast, where, yes, the hero has triumphed over his enemies, but it's come at a very severe personal cost, and he's definitely not in a good place at the end of his victory. So yeah, that's really my only big complaint about this novel, that the last act just feels really rushed and inconsistent with Robert E. Howard's writing style. I would actually recommend it to anyone who is a fan of planetary romance or someone who's already a fan of Robert E. Howard. This is just a darn good adventure novel. If it was a movie, it would just be, a fun action flick to kind of turn your brain off and enjoy. All right, enough about that book. Let's talk about this book, Three-Bladed Doom. Now, don't let this cover fool you. Don't let this scantily clad barbarian warrior with his even more scantily clad female hostage fool you. And don't let the little blurb at the top that says Fantasy Adventure by the creator of Conan fool you either. This is not fantasy. This has nothing to do with fantasy. This is a novel about Robert E. Howard's character, Francis Xavier Gordon, otherwise known as Almuric, the Swift One. He's this sort of American adventurer, mercenary character. He's sort of Robert E. Howard's Americanized twist on T.E. Lawrence of Arabia. And like Lawrence of Arabia, his stories take place in the 1910s, around World War I in the Middle East. This novel takes place mostly in Afghanistan. Now, this edition was the first edition of the original version to be published in 1977, well after Howard's death. An earlier version of the story was published in the 1950s by L. Sprague de Camp, but it was reworked into a Conan story under the title The Flame Knife, because that's what L. Sprague de Camp would do. If he couldn't find another Conan story to make money off of, he would just repurpose a totally unrelated Robert E. Howard story into a Conan story. He would change the names around, he would insert some supernatural fantasy elements, and he'd pass it off as a Conan story. If I have not made it 100% clear on this channel in the past, L. Sprague de Camp had no respect for Robert E. Howard's writing, but he was more than willing to make money off of Robert E. Howard's name. But I digress. This novel starts off in Afghanistan with our main character, Francis Xavier Gordon, Almuric, tracking down a group of elusive assassins who supposedly are part of a criminal organization known as the Hidden Ones. Lately, the Hidden Ones have been targeting a number of prominent political leaders all across the Middle East and Asia, always leaving behind their calling card, a three-bladed dagger, hence the title of the book, Three-Bladed Doom. Recently, they've made an attempt on the life of a prominent Afghan leader who just so happens to be a good personal friend of Almuric's, and so now Gordon wants justice. And of course, in true Robert E. Howard main character fashion, he's going to get it himself. So Gordon saddles up with a group of his best men and takes off into the desert to find these assassins. And he tracks them down to this dark desert gorge where he and his men find a hidden city. It's this city that's seemingly been there for thousands and thousands of years, supposedly part of this ancient, extinct civilization. And the Hidden Ones have repurposed it into their hideout, their sort of base of operations where they work from the shadows. And so now the major thrust of the novel is Almuric and his companions infiltrating this city and dismantling this criminal organization from the inside out. Because as they discover, the leader of the Hidden Ones is in fact trying to take over the world.
Of course!
Yep, I just made a nostalgia critic joke in one of my videos. So that's where I'm at now. Now, I don't mean to be hyperbolic, and I realize that this is probably just because I'm so excited to be reading a story from a series by Robert E. Howard that I've never read before. But Three-Bladed Doom might be the best book I've read this year so far. This book is absolutely fantastic. It is just nonstop action and adventure, pure pulp action and adventure from beginning to end. There is not a single ounce of filler on this book. There is not a single scene or line of dialogue or story beat that felt out of place. It all has its place in this book. The pace is absolutely perfect, and it is so gloriously, venomously violent. Our main character, Almuric, is just the baddest dude around. He's a gunfighter, he's a sword fighter, he's a fist fighter, and he messes up the villains in this story so much. In every single fight scene and action sequence, there are fountains of blood and entrails being spewed on the ground. There are limbs and heads flying from their severed bodies. Oh, it's just so wonderful. It really is Robert E. Howard at his bloody best, pushing that high-octane, adrenaline junkie storytelling, and I just could not get enough of it. Like I said, the pacing is excellent, and it almost had this sort of cinematic quality to it, to the point where, as I'm flipping through the pages and following along with the action, I can almost hear the sound effects and the sweeping orchestral score in my mind, as if I'm watching an old school action adventure movie. And it almost makes me wish that at some point we would have gotten an El Borak movie, maybe starring Arnold Schwarzenegger as Francis Xavier Gordon. Look, if he can play Conan, he can play El Borak. It's similarly hokey casting, okay? But what more can I say about this book? Is there anything I didn't like about it? The editing can be a little sloppy at times. There are a lot of typos and a few syntax errors that made me think, what was that all about? I think that's really kind of a result of the publishers cobbling this story back together in its original form from the L. Sprague de Camp Flame Knife version. But none of those really distracted me from enjoying the reading experience. For me, this book is 5 stars, 10 out of 10. Even if you don't like Robert E. Howard, if you're a fan of classic action-adventure storytelling, there is no reason why you shouldn't read Three-Bladed Doom. I highly, highly recommend it. But that's just what I think. Let me know in the comments below. Have you ever read Almuric or Three-Bladed Doom? Let me know what you thought of these books. And whatever the case, I hope you'll join me in the next review. Until then, as always, farewell and keep reading.
Of course!